The rain was a constant presence in Evergreen Bluffs, a soft, percussive rhythm against the window panes of the life Elena Vance had so carefully designed. It was more than weather. It was the soundtrack to a certain kind of Pacific Northwest contentment, a reason to feel grateful for the warmth and light within. From her seat in the living room, she could see the tidy beds of lavender and rosemary she had planted, their silvery green leaves beaded with moisture. The house, a 1920s craftsman she and Liam had bought as a wreck and painstakingly restored, was her proudest creation. Every line was clean, every joint was true, every room flowed into the next with a logic that felt as natural and as comforting as breathing. For 7 years, this house had been a sanctuary. Now it was starting to feel like a museum, and she was its lonely, anxious curator. The source of the anxiety was sitting across the room, though his body was the only part of him present. Liam. Her Liam. He stared at the television, but his eyes were unfocused, glazed over with a remoteness that had become his default state. The remote control lay slack in his hand. He hadn't changed the channel in over an hour. It was a documentary about deep-sea exploration, full of dark, crushing pressures and strange, alien life, a fitting, if unwitting, choice. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice a little too bright. "The anglerfish, it's terrifyingly beautiful." Liam blinked, his focus pulling back from some immense internal distance. "Huh? Oh, yeah, incredible." The word was a hollow echo, devoid of the genuine curiosity he once possessed. The old Liam would have launched into a monologue about bioluminescence or the engineering challenges of deep-sea submersibles. He worked as a project manager at Aerodyne Global, a giant in the aerospace world, and his mind was a beautiful, restless machine, always dissecting, always questioning. Now, that machine seemed to have seized up, its gears grinding silently in the dark. For 6 months, the change had been a gradual erosion. It started with late nights at the office, blamed on a high-stakes project involving a new propulsion system. Elena, who understood the pressures of deadlines, had been supportive. She'd keep dinner warm, she'd leave the porch light on. But the late nights became a pattern, bleeding into weekends. Then came the secrecy with his phone. He, who had once left it lying on the kitchen counter for hours, now kept it on his person at all times, screen down. It would sometimes vibrate, and he would stiffen, his eyes darting around as if to see who had noticed. She had noticed. She noticed everything. It was the blessing and the curse of an architect's mind. She saw the fine tremor in his hands when he poured his coffee, the new habit of checking the locks twice before bed, the way his smiles no longer reach his eyes. They were sketches of a smile, approximations of an emotion he could no longer genuinely access. They still went through the motions. They had dinner with friends where Liam would perform a convincing replica of his old self, laughing at the right moments, asking the right questions. But Elena could see the strain. It was a masterful performance, but it was a performance nonetheless. And when they came home, the mask would drop and the hollowed-out stranger would return. Tonight, the silence between them was heavier than the damp air outside. The documentary ended. The screen went black, reflecting their two still figures in the dimly lit room. Two people who shared a house, a bed, a name, but no longer a reality. "I'm going to head up," Liam said, pushing himself out of the chair with the weary sigh of a much older man. "Is everything okay at work?" Elena asked, the question carefully casual. She had asked it 100 times. Yeah, fine. Just a lot of pressure. This project, it's a beast. He ran a hand through his hair. I'll probably be in the study for a bit. He didn't kiss her goodnight. He just turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy on the polished oak stairs. Elena remained on the sofa, the reflection in the black screen her only company. Her heart ached with a familiar, sickening thud. Her logical mind, desperate for an explanation, had run through every possibility: stress, depression, a midlife crisis. But it kept circling back with the relentless pull of gravity to the one explanation that fit the constellation of symptoms: secrecy, distance, a phone guarded like a state secret. An affair. The word itself felt like a violation, a vulgar intrusion into the clean, well-ordered world she had built. It was a cliché. It was something that happened to other people, to people with cracks in their foundations. Her foundation with Liam had been, she believed, solid rock.
She pulled out her phone and opened her text thread with Chloe. He's in his study again, said it was work. We sat in the same room for 2 hours and barely said 10 words. Chloe's reply was almost instantaneous. She was a family lawyer. She lived and breathed this stuff. I'm so sorry, Elle. This is classic, textbook even. Walling you out, creating a separate life. You can't keep living in this limbo. I know, but what do? I feel paralyzed. Confronting him without proof? He'll just deny it. He'll say I'm crazy. You're not crazy. Your gut is screaming at you. Listen to it. You're an architect. You believe in evidence. You need to get some. Elena's fingers trembled over the keyboard. The thought had been a dark seed in her mind for weeks, a profane idea she kept pushing away. But Chloe's words were like water and sunlight. The seed was sprouting. How? Hire a PI? It feels so sordid. It is sordid. The situation is sordid. Or there's another way. A modern way. You control the environment. You own the house. Elena knew exactly what she meant. She closed her eyes, and an image bloomed in her mind. Tiny, discreet lenses, hidden in smoke detectors, in digital clocks, in the spine of a book. The thought made her feel sick, like a trespasser in her own life. It was a profound violation of the trust her marriage was supposed to be built on. But what trust was left to violate? She stayed on the sofa for a long time, the rain tapping, tapping, tapping against the glass. It sounded like a nagging question. She thought of her work, of old houses with hidden rot, of walls that had to be torn down to save the structure. Sometimes you had to see the ugliest truths before you could begin to rebuild. Or, she thought, with a cold wave of dread, before you knew it was time to condemn the whole thing. With a resolve that felt both foreign and absolute, she opened her laptop. She bypassed the arts and culture sites she usually browsed and typed "best discreet home security cameras" into the search bar. The results flooded the screen, a marketplace of mistrust. She selected a set that looked like unassuming USB chargers and a digital clock. She paid for expedited shipping. The act felt like a betrayal, but as she closed the laptop, a different feeling began to surface, sharp and cold and clear. It was the feeling of taking back control. She was no longer a passive observer of her life's decay. She was going to find the rot. She was going to expose it to the light. Whatever the truth was, she thought, it couldn't be worse than this suffocating, silent dread. She was wrong. The cameras arrived 2 days later in a nondescript cardboard box, their clinical packaging a stark contrast to the emotional chaos they represented. Elena waited until Liam left for a Saturday morning meeting to install them. Her hands were steady, her movements precise, an architect's muscle memory overriding the tremor in her soul. One in the living room, disguised as a phone charger plugged into the wall. One in the kitchen, same again. The last one, the one that felt like the most profound transgression, was the small digital clock she placed on the bookshelf in their study. It had a wide-angle lens. It would see everything. She linked them to a secure app on a new burner tablet she'd bought for cash. The thought of her own counter-surveillance made her feel like a character in a spy movie, a genre she and Liam used to enjoy together. The irony was a bitter pill. For the first few days, she became a ghost in her own home, compulsively checking the live feeds, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was hunting for the cliché, the furtive, whispered phone call, the smiling, secret text exchange with a name and heart emoji. She watched, and she waited for the evidence that would break her heart but validate her sanity. The evidence never came. What she saw instead was something far more disturbing. The cameras didn't capture a man in the throes of a secret passion. They captured a man in a state of private, silent agony. The first clip that truly unnerved me was from the living room camera. Liam came home, thinking the house was empty. He dropped his briefcase by the door, and for a full 5 minutes, he just stood there, his back to the camera, his head bowed. His shoulders shook with a single contained sob before he straightened up, wiped his face, and composed himself, the mask of normalcy clicking back into place just as I walked in from the garden.
The footage from the study was worse. It was his private stage. She watched a silent film of his torment, night after night. He wouldn't work. He would sit at his large mahogany desk, the desk they had picked out together at a vintage market, and stare at the dark screen of his computer. He would pace the length of the room, from the window overlooking the rainy street to the wall of books, his path a well-worn track of anxiety. He'd run his hands through his hair, muttering to himself, the words too low for the microphone to pick up. Sometimes he would just stand by the window, motionless for half an hour at a time, a silhouette against the perpetual gray twilight, looking out as if expecting a threat to materialize from the manicured lawns and quiet suburban streets. There were no secret calls. When his phone buzzed, he would flinch, snatch it up, and stare at the screen with an expression of pure dread. He would type a curt reply and toss the phone down as if it were burning him. This was not the behavior of a man cheating on his wife. Elena had seen that before, in friends, in clients. There was a giddy, nervous energy to infidelity, a secret joy that couldn't be entirely suppressed. This was different. This was the behavior of a caged animal. This was terror. Her theory crumbled. The neat, painful box she had put her husband's behavior into shattered, leaving her with 1,000 sharp, unidentifiable pieces. The relief that he wasn't cheating was instantly swallowed by a much larger, more terrifying fear. If it wasn't an affair, then what was it? What could reduce this brilliant, confident man to a pacing, weeping shell of himself? The chasm between them grew. Her silence, once born of suspicion, was now born of confusion and a creeping dread. How could she ask him what was wrong when she had no frame of reference for the question? The cameras, her tools of espionage, had only deepened the mystery. Her home, once the symbol of their shared life, now felt like a surveillance state of her own making. The clean lines felt sterile. The large windows, designed to let in light, now felt like exposures. After a week of this, she couldn't take it anymore.
The not knowing was a cancer, metastasizing in the quiet rooms of their home. She needed to tear down the wall, whatever the cost. That night, Liam came home late again. He looked exhausted, his face pale and drawn. He went through his usual ritual, a vague excuse about a server issue, a quick, loveless peck on her cheek, and the slow retreat towards his study. "Liam, wait," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it stopped him in his tracks. He turned, his expression wary. "What's up?" "Don't go in there tonight," she said. "Come, sit with me." He hesitated, a flicker of something, panic, in his eyes, but he followed her to the living room sofa, sitting on the opposite end, chasm of patterned upholstery between them. Elena took a deep breath, the air feeling thin and sharp in her lungs. She had rehearsed this. No accusations, no anger, just the truth of what she had seen. "I know something is wrong," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "And I know it's not work, not just work. And I know you're not having an affair." His head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. "What?" "I've been watching you, Liam," she confessed, the words tasting like poison. She saw a muscle jump in his jaw. He was calculating, processing. "What are you talking about?" Instead of answering, she picked up the tablet from the coffee table. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely unlock the screen. She navigated to the video files and selected a clip from 2 nights ago. She turned the tablet to face him. On the screen, the Liam of 2 nights ago was pacing the study. The camera's vantage point from the bookshelf gave the scene a cold, observational quality. The figure on the screen stopped, leaned his forehead against the cool glass of the window, and his shoulders began to heave. There was no sound, but his anguish was absolute. Liam stared at the image of his own private grief, his face draining of all color. He looked from the tablet back to her, his mouth slightly agape. The mask was gone. In its place was raw, unadulterated fear. "Elena," he whispered, his voice a ragged edge of sound. "This isn't a man who is cheating," she said, her own tears finally breaking free, hot and fast. "This is a man who is being destroyed by something. This is a man who is terrified. So I'm asking you again, not as an angry wife, but as the person who loves you more than anything. Who are you, Liam? What is happening to us?" The unexpected empathy was the key. An accusation would have been met with a wall of denial, but her raw, desperate plea for understanding found a crack in his armor. He stared at his own image on the screen, a man broken and alone. He let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound that seemed to be torn from the deepest part of him. He buried his face in his hands, and his body began to shake with the violent, wrenching sobs he had so carefully hidden for months. Elena closed the distance between them, sliding across the sofa and wrapping her arms around his trembling frame. He collapsed against her, all pretense of strength gone. The dam had broken. For a long time, he just cried, a storm of grief and fear unleashed into the quiet, listening room. Elena held him, stroking his hair, whispering his name, her own heart breaking for a reason she still didn't understand. When the sobs finally subsided into ragged gasps, he pulled back, his face wrecked with tears and shame. He looked at her, his eyes full of a terrifying gravity. "You have to promise me something," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You have to promise you won't do anything. You won't tell anyone. Not Chloe, not the police, no one." "Liam, what is it? You're scaring me." He took her hands, his grip painfully tight. My life depends on it. Your life depends on it. And then, in a low, rushed torrent of words, the truth came out. It wasn't a story of infidelity. It was a story that belonged in the dark, paranoid thrillers they used to watch. It was a story of a mistake made years ago, a stupid investment that led to a mountain of secret debt before he even met her. A story of being targeted, of a man named Silas who knew about the debt, who approached him with an offer that seemed at the time like a lifeline. He said it was nothing, Liam choked out, his eyes wild. Just some low-level industry analysis, things that were practically public knowledge. He said companies did it all the time. Corporate intelligence, he called it. The money, it cleared the debt. I thought it was over. But it wasn't over. It was a hook. Once he was in, they owned him. The requests escalated. He was a senior project manager at Aerodyne, privy to some of the most advanced proprietary aerospace technology in the world. The propulsion system he was working on now, it was a game changer. And they're not a rival company, Elena, he whispered, the final, terrible truth dropping into the space between them. It's a foreign government. I'm committing espionage, economic espionage. The words didn't compute. They were abstract, alien. Espionage, spies. It was the language of fiction, not the language of their life in Evergreen Bluffs. They have everything, he continued, his voice cracking. Financial records, photos of us, of you, your work schedule, Chloe's name. They made it very clear. If I stop, if I get caught, it's not just me they'll hurt. They said they'd make it look like an accident, a car crash, a home invasion gone wrong, something random, plausible. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. The room seemed to tilt, the carefully chosen furniture, the warm lighting, all of it dissolving into a landscape of unimaginable threat. The rain against the windows no longer sounded soft and comforting. It sounded like fingers, tapping, trying to get in. Her mind, the logical, architectural mind, reeled. The late nights weren't for a lover. They were for downloading files onto encrypted drives. The guarded phone wasn't for secret texts. It was for coded instructions from a handler named Silas. The pacing, the weeping, the paranoia, it was the crushing weight of treason and the constant, gnawing fear for her life, for their lives. She looked at the man she had married. He was a stranger, a criminal, a victim, all at once. The foundation of her life, the bedrock she had believed was so solid, wasn't just cracked, it was a void. It had never been real. So you have to promise me, Elena, Liam begged, his eyes locking onto hers, pleading with all the desperation of a drowning man. We keep living our lives, exactly as before. We smile for the neighbors, we go to dinner with friends, and you say nothing. You tell no one. Your silence is the only thing keeping us alive. She stared into his terrified eyes and saw the truth of his words. Her cameras, which she had set up to uncover a simple domestic betrayal, had instead revealed a secret that was going to bury them both. She was no longer just a wife. She was an accomplice, a hostage in her own home. She gave a slow, numb nod. The promise was a cage door, swinging shut and locking behind her. The click it made was silent, but in her mind,
It was the loudest sound she had ever heard. The days that followed the confession were a study in cognitive dissonance. On the surface, nothing had changed. The sun, in a rare act of Seattle generosity, even came out, casting long, cheerful shadows across the lawn. They still had coffee together in the morning. Liam still went to work. Elena still reviewed blueprints for the restoration of a Tudor-style home in Laurelhurst. But beneath this thin veneer of normalcy, everything was fractured, poisoned. The house, her sanctuary, had transformed overnight into a high-security prison, and she was both its inmate and its warden. Every object was now imbued with a sinister new meaning. The wedding photo on the mantel, two smiling, naive people, blissfully unaware of the abyss opening beneath their feet, was a mockery. The mahogany desk in the study was no longer a beautiful antique. It was an altar of treason. The constant, low hum of the refrigerator sounded like a listening device. Her own body felt alien. She was an actress thrust into the role of a lifetime without a script. The role was Elena Vance, happy wife. She had to smile at the checkout clerk, make small talk with the mailman, and nod along as her client agonized over kitchen countertops, all while a silent scream was clawing its way up her throat. The most difficult performance was with Chloe. Her friend called the day after the confession, her voice brimming with righteous, supportive anger. "So, did you talk to him?" Chloe asked, her lawyerly tone sharp. "Did the bastard confess?" Elena stood in the kitchen, clutching the phone, her back pressed against the cold steel of the refrigerator. She could feel the vibration of its motor through her spine. "Yes," she said, her voice a carefully constructed monotone. "We talked." "And? What's her name?" Elena's mind went blank. She needed a name, a plausible, boring name. "Amanda," she said, the name popping into her head from nowhere. "Someone from work." "Amanda," Chloe repeated, the name dripping with disdain. "Of course. And what was his excuse? It's not what you think? It just happened?" "Something like that," Elena mumbled, the lie feeling thick and foul in her mouth. She was protecting him. She was protecting them. She was building a false wall around their catastrophic truth. "Okay, listen to me," Chloe said, her voice shifting into professional mode. "Don't move out. Don't do anything drastic. We need to get our ducks in a row. I'm sending you the name of the best divorce attorney in the city. We'll start by freezing the assets." "No," Elena cut in, her voice sharper than she intended. "Not yet. I need to think." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Elle, this isn't something to think about. He cheated on you. It's a breach of contract. You protect yourself and you get out. End of story." If only it were that simple, Elena thought. A wave of hysterical laughter bubbling in her chest. A simple breach of contract. A simple divorce. How she yearned for such a clean, comprehensible tragedy. "I just need some time, Chloe," she said, her voice softening into a plea. "Please." Chloe sighed, a sound of frustrated affection. "Okay, but don't let him sweet-talk you. Don't let him play the victim. You're the victim here, remember that." Elena hung up the phone and leaned her head against the refrigerator, the cold seeping into her skin. "You're the victim here." The words echoed in her mind. Was she? Or was Liam?
Were they both victims of something vast and faceless? A geopolitical game played by men in rooms she couldn't imagine? A game whose consequences were now playing out in her beautiful, meticulously designed kitchen? Living with Liam was the hardest part. The confession hadn't brought them closer. It had codified the chasm between them. He was desperate to connect, his eyes constantly seeking hers, full of apology and fear. He'd try to touch her, a hand on her arm, a brush against her back, and she would flinch, her body recoiling instinctively. He was no longer just her husband. He was the source of the threat, the embodiment of the lie that had consumed their life. He tried to explain, to make her understand. "They have protocols, Alina," he told her one night, his voice a low whisper in the dark of their bedroom. They slept with a new, rigid space between them. "I use a specific coffee shop's public Wi-Fi. I get the instructions on an encrypted app that erases itself. I transfer the files to a dead drop, a hollowed-out book left in the library, a USB drive taped under a park bench. It's organized. They're professionals." He said it as if the professionalism of their tormentors was a comfort. To Elena, it was the opposite. It meant this wasn't random or chaotic. It was a cold, calculated system of control, and they were just two small cogs within it. Her paranoia grew, blooming like toxic mold in the damp Seattle air. A white van parked across the street for too long sent a jolt of ice through her veins. A stranger's prolonged gaze in the grocery store made her skin crawl. Was that him? A watcher? She began to see threats everywhere. She deleted the camera app from her tablet, smashing the device with a hammer in the garage and burying the pieces deep in the trash. The thought of any lens, even her own, watching them now was unbearable. Her work, once her refuge, became a profound source of stress. How could she focus on the placement of a supporting beam in a client's house when the very foundations of her own were a lie? How could she debate the merits of slate versus cedar shingles when she was convinced a sniper might be hiding on a neighboring roof? One afternoon, standing on a construction site, she watched a crane hoist a massive steel I-beam into the sky. It swung precariously for a moment, a multi-ton weight suspended by a cable, and she was struck by a powerful, dizzying sense of vertigo. That was her life, suspended, held in place by a single, fraying cable of silence, swinging over a terrifying drop. She began to break down in small, private ways. She would be washing dishes and suddenly find herself unable to breathe, gripping the edge of the sink, her heart pounding. She lost weight. Dark circles like bruises formed under her eyes. She, the architect of order, was living in a state of absolute internal chaos. Liam saw it, of course. He saw her fragility, her fear, and his own guilt was a constant, palpable presence in the house. "I'm so sorry, Elena," he would say over and over, the words becoming a meaningless mantra. "I did this to protect you, I swear. I thought I was protecting you from the debt, from the past." "Protecting me?" she finally snapped one evening, her control shattering like glass. They were in the kitchen, the room glowing with the soft under-cabinet lighting she had so carefully chosen. "You didn't protect me, Liam. You made me a prisoner. You turned our home into a cage and our life into a lie. Don't you see? There is no us to protect anymore. There's just you and me, and this thing that lives with us now, this fear." Her outburst left them in a stunned silence, the truth of her words hanging in the air. He flinched as if she had struck him, his face crumpling in pain. In that moment, she saw him not as a monster or a traitor, but as a man who had made a catastrophic series of choices, a man just as trapped as she was. The anger receded, leaving behind only a vast, desolate landscape of grief. Grief for the man he used to be. Grief for the woman she had been. Grief for the life they had lost, a life that was, she now understood, only ever an illusion. She went to bed that night and dreamed she was in their house, but the walls were made of glass, and outside, standing in the rain, were hundreds of people with blank, impassive faces, all of them watching. She woke up with a gasp, the sheets damp with sweat, the feeling of being watched seared into her consciousness. The gilded cage was no longer a metaphor. It was her reality, and she didn't know if she would ever escape. The weeks bled into a month, then 2. Elena learned to live on the knife's edge of her new reality. The initial shock and paralysis hardened into a kind of grim, functional despair. She was a masterful actress. She hosted a book club, discussing the fictional dramas of other people's lives with a convincing intellectual detachment. She had lunch with Chloe, feeding her a carefully curated narrative of marital strife, of a couple trying to work it through, a lie that made her stomach turn, but kept Chloe's well-meaning interference at bay. The house remained a place of profound tension. Liam moved through it like a ghost, his guilt a shroud he wore. He had stopped trying to touch her, stopped with the whispered apologies. They were 2 satellites orbiting a dead star, held in place by a shared, terrible gravity, but never getting any closer. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the unspoken horror of their situation.
The turning point was not a dramatic event, but a quiet, internal shift. It happened on a Tuesday. Elena was at her drafting table, a sheet of vellum spread before her, the faint, clean scent of the paper, a ghost of her former life. She was trying to solve a structural problem for the Tudor house, how to open up a load-bearing wall without compromising the integrity of the second floor. She sketched out solutions: a laminated veneer lumber beam, a steel flitch plate. Her mind, for the first time in months, slipped back into its natural groove. It analyzed the problem. It identified the stress points. It designed a new support system. She looked at the elegant, logical lines she had drawn, and a thought surfaced, clear and sharp as a shard of glass. This is a structural problem. Her own life. It wasn't just a tragedy to be endured. It was a compromised structure, a building on the verge of collapse. And she was an architect. Her entire life, her entire being was dedicated to understanding structures, finding their weaknesses, and making them strong again. For months, she had been living like a victim, trapped in the rubble of Liam's choices. She had been passive, reactive, her days defined by fear and grief. But as she stared at the blueprint, she realized that passivity was its own form of surrender. Fear was a cage, but it was a cage she was choosing to stay inside. The thought didn't bring her joy. It brought a cold, terrifying clarity. She couldn't rely on Liam. He was the compromised beam. She couldn't rely on the police. Involving them would, as Liam had made clear, bring the whole house down on top of them in the most violent way imaginable. She couldn't rely on Chloe or anyone in her old life, because they didn't even know what building they were in.
There was only one person she could rely on, herself. A new kind of energy began to stir within her. It wasn't hope. It was something harder, more pragmatic. It was resolve. If her life was a compromised structure, she would be the one to design the solution. She wouldn't be a passive inmate anymore. She would become the architect of her own survival. Her behavior began to change, but in ways so subtle that even Liam, in his fog of guilt, didn't notice at first. She stopped crying in the shower. She started eating again, methodically, as if fueling a machine. The haunted, victimized look in her eyes was slowly replaced by a watchful, calculating intensity. Her first act was to gather intelligence. She had destroyed her old cameras, but she was an expert in surveillance now. She started by observing Liam. She noted the days he was most agitated, cross-referencing them with his work calendar. She learned to read the almost imperceptible shifts in his mood that signaled a delivery was imminent. He thought she was just numb. In reality, she was studying him, mapping the patterns of his captivity. Her second act was to arm herself with knowledge. She bought another burner tablet, this one more sophisticated. In the dead of night, while Liam slept his restless, twitching sleep, she would go to the guest room and descend into the digital rabbit hole. She didn't research espionage. That was too dangerous. Instead, she researched its components. She learned about data encryption, about virtual private networks, about how to create firewalled digital archives that were virtually untraceable. She read about corporate law, about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, about the structures of international holding companies used for money laundering. She devoured information with the same meticulous hunger she once reserved for architectural history. She created a new email account, an anonymous, heavily encrypted one. From there, she opened a cloud storage account, triple encrypted, and secured with a 40-character password she committed to memory. This was her secret blueprint. This was her new foundation. Slowly, carefully, she began to build her case. She didn't know who she was building it for yet. Herself? A future where she might have leverage? A last resort? The why was less important than the what. The act of doing it, of creating her own secret structure within the larger prison, was an act of profound self-reclamation. She reactivated the voice memo app on her own phone. One night, when Liam was talking in his sleep, mumbling about Silas and the deadline, she recorded it. The sound of his carified, sleeping voice was a chilling but necessary piece of evidence. She uploaded the file to her secure cloud and deleted it from her phone. She found a receipt for a burner phone he had hidden in an old coat pocket. She photographed it, uploaded it, and put the receipt back exactly where she'd found it. She started a coded journal on her tablet, a timeline of events disguised as architectural notes. Stress test on primary beams failed, 10/17, was her entry for the night of his confession. Subcontractor S demands accelerated schedule was her note for a day he came home pale and shaking. She was building something. A black box. A detailed record of their catastrophe, known only to her. This new, secret purpose changed the dynamic between them. Her fear didn't vanish, but it was now tempered with something else, a cold, focused anger. Her pity for Liam curdled into a kind of detached assessment. He was a variable in her equation, a structural weakness she had to account for. One evening, they were sitting in the living room, a perfect replica of so many nights before. Liam was staring at the blank television screen, lost in his private hell. Elena was watching him, but not as a heartbroken wife. She was watching him as an architect assesses a failing structure. She saw the lines of stress around his eyes, the slump of his shoulders under an invisible weight, the tremor in his hand as he lifted a glass of water. He seemed to feel her gaze and turned to look at her. For a moment, he must have seen something different in her expression. Not fear, not grief, but a chilling self-possession. "Elena?" he asked, a hint of confusion in his voice. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Liam," she said. Her voice was calm, level. It was the calm of a surgeon before the first incision, the calm of a pilot in a storm. She had accepted the truth. The life she'd had was gone. The man she had loved was gone, replaced by this haunted shell. Her beautiful house was not a home, but a stage. But accepting the truth was not the same as surrendering to it. She realized the real prison hadn't been the threats from Silas or Liam's secret. The real prison had been her own belief that she was helpless. It had been her grief for a past that was never real, and her fear of a future she couldn't control. Now she was taking control. She didn't know what her final design would be. Would she find a way to anonymously tip off the right people at Aerodyne? Would she use her evidence to negotiate their escape? Would she simply wait, gathering strength and information until the moment came to tear the whole rotten structure down and build something new on her own? She didn't have the answers, but for the first time in months, she had a plan. It was a terrifying, solitary plan, built in the dark, but it was hers. She looked at Liam, this broken man who had shattered her world, and she felt a final, sad detachment. He was still staring at her, looking for a sign of the woman he had married, but that woman was gone. In her place was someone new, someone who understood that the only truly safe foundation was the one you built for yourself out of the hardest, coldest, most unbreakable materials you could find. She was no longer a resident of this gilded cage. She was its architect, and she was just beginning to draw up the plans.